dig into child's pose. You've probably tried this in your practice as a resting pose or a transition pose. There's a couple of ways that we can do this depending on what we want for our practice, as well as how our body is feeling that day. Most common is bringing those legs together and draping the torso over the legs, creating a soft rounding in the spine. Another variation is bringing the big toes together, walking the knees apart, and letting that chest sink in between those legs, creating a more neutral spine, but allowing a little bit more opening in that chest and those shoulders. Here's the two variations. Bringing those legs together, we sit those hips back, and then we allow those arms to come out long, letting that head come down towards the mat. Our second variation is to keep those big toes together, but walk those knees apart. This creates the space for the torso to come in between those knees. Again, those hips stay synced down towards those heels, and then we start to surrender that chest down towards the mat. If you are paying attention to our lower back, variation 2 with those legs further apart may be a better option for you. It creates less rounding in that lower back and a more neutral spine. If we want to create length in this posture, rather than just use it as a resting pose, I love to imagine filling my head with a big breath of air, and then as I exhale, it travels down the spine. So coming back into that child's pose, taking those arms out long, let that head come down to the mat. Imagine filling that head up with a big breath of air. And then as we exhale, imagine that breath traveling down the spine, all the way down to that tailbone. The more breaths you take like that, especially using that intention, you're going to start to feel that length within the spine. The fun thing about child's pose is there's so many different varieties to it to suit what we really want out of it. And more variations than just the legs. We can change up how we're putting those arms to create differences in this pose. As I've showed, arms out long, we have a few other options here. So we can have palms flat on the ground like I previously demonstrated, or if we want to create a more advantageous position for our joints, we can come up onto those cupcake hands. So coming back into that child's pose, instead of placing those palms flat down on the ground, we can come up onto those fingertips and then sink in between those arms. This also creates a little bit more opening underneath those arms and within that chest and those shoulders. Another variation is to put those hands back towards those heels. So kind of curling yourself up into that little ball. Those hands can come back and find those heels. Yet another variation, if we'd like even more opening through the chest and the shoulders, is coming into prayer hands and bringing the thumbs to the back of the neck. So we start by coming into that child's pose. We can also use blocks under those elbows here, but those elbows come down to the floor. Those hands come into a prayer, and then we bring the thumbs to the back of the neck. Two more variations here are placing blocks under the hands to create more of that surrender into the chest, as well as blocks under those elbows if we're doing the prayer hands. There's lots of different variations, and each practice may be different depending on what we're looking to get out of it. So while we're using child's pose as a resting pose a lot of the time, we can bring more intention by paying attention to how we're positioning the body and what variations we're using.